Let me see now if I can work this properly. You should get my presentation, but it's not working. Oh, sorry. Okay. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the elastic enterprise, and I'm going to talk about how enterprises around the world are remaking innovation. I tend not to focus on products. I won't be able to tell you how to create a new product, but I might be able to tell you how to change your organization. And answer some of these questions. You know, how do you become more innovative on a systemic level? How do you change that organization? How do you make it fit for the future? And what does the future organization look like, and what do the people in it do? What's the expectation of people in this future organization? And when people ask those kind of questions normally, they start to talk about being more creative. So how do we become more creative people? How do our employees become more creative? And I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think that you need to be asking, how do we make better decisions? How do we improve the judgment of our people? And to illustrate that, a couple of quotes from people that I've interviewed recently. This is Mike Shinoda, who's the producer of Linkin Park, one of the most successful bands of the past 10 years. And when Shinoda talks about being creative, he actually talks about creating data. So he says, normally when people think of making music, they think that you write and then you record and then you mix. But we don't do that. Though it's terrifying and confusing to some artists, we do all three at once. We mix, we write, we open audio files, we throw things onto the phone. And he's describing a process where actually, for him, creativity is about creating many, many options. So for Linkin Park, they might be recording on the metro, they might be even humming something onto their phones. They create numerous options that then become the raw material that they work with. But actually making good music from that is about good judgment and good decision making. And you can see also here from Alicia Keys, she has a similar kind of process. So her creative process, she's talking about writing the song Girl on Fire. And she says he, the producer, Salem Remy, started going through his sample library on all these different crazy drums. And there were these loud, obnoxious, just destructive drums. And I was like, yeah, Girl on Fire is loud and obnoxious and destructive. And you know, if you can accept that kind of enthusiasm, she's saying something similar to Shinoda, that the way to create things is to create options for yourself and to regard the information around you as raw material to do things with. So I think these are different ways of looking at creativity, and I think they're the most important way that an organization can think about creativity. Though I think organizations typically impose some other view of change and creativity on their staff and ask them somehow to be more creative. But when you start to think about it in terms of options, you can start to see that if you look at the big changes in the past 5 to 10 years, for example, Steve Jobs decided to go with the iPhone and not the iPad. And that was one of the big historical decisions in modern business. The iPad was there ready to go. All his engineers wanted to do this tablet, but he said, no, let's do the phone. So I think that, again, you know, just to emphasize that actually, in terms of innovation, your decision-making prowess, your judgment is far more important than any idea you might have that you can somehow become more creative. And I want to hold that in mind as I now talk about 4 shifts. The first shift I'm going to talk about is the externalization of core processes. In fact, the transition of the very idea of core to something much more fluid. You're very likely as an organization to think that you have core competencies because for the past 30 years, academic writers have told you that that's what you must have and that's what you must focus on. But we're moving away from that, and I think well, let me say, when I normally talk about this, when I talk about externalization, people say, oh, you mean outsourcing. We have a call center. Of course, we outsource. But I don't mean outsourcing. I mean, for example, the train manufacturer Bombardier now externalizes all its risk, or a good deal of its risk, onto its brake manufacturer. So traditionally, Bombardier has been the totem of the train. You know, that all the responsibility, all the brand equity lies with Bombardier. Now they're saying, no, no, our brake system manufacturer is responsible if there's an accident. So they've effectively devolved or externalized risk. If you look at the way Apple scaled its business in the past 5 to 7 years, it was externalizing app production to a community of people. They didn't outsource app production. But they did externalize it, and in externalizing it, managed to engender 500,000 apps that allowed the iPhone to become the kind of iconic product of the last decade, maybe the last 30 or 40 years. So I want to emphasize the idea of externalization as distinct from outsourcing, because I think if all you can think about in terms of offloading burden from your management team is outsourcing, then you're missing opportunity. And I'm going to describe this now in terms of a longer term shift, because I think that one of the things that you need to do as a management team is to understand a kind of 30-year trajectory rather than a 2 to 5 year trajectory. And to illustrate this, I want to just tell you about some research I did 2 years ago for the Harvard Business Review. I analysed the Harvard Business Review's archives, and to do that I actually used an Australian tool, it's Leximancer, produced at the University of Melbourne. We took articles from these 4 periods, 1990, 2000, 2004, 2007, and we analysed what business writers were saying about failure, because 3 of those periods are recessions. You may not have experienced this in Australia, but for the rest of us, the last 25 years have been more marked by recession than they have by growth. So it was interesting to look at what business writers were saying about what businesses were getting wrong in these periods. I did include 2004, 2006, so the peak of the boom, if you like. In the early part of this period, 1990, business writers were really focused on the transition from that old industrial manufacturing culture to a services culture. But they were talking about how we were getting it wrong. So the message essentially was, we have this once-in-a-lifetime historic transition, but we're not doing it very well. We are not becoming very service-centric. A decade later, there hadn't been all that much improvement. We were still getting this transition wrong, but the focus of attention was on the employee, and it was about the employee not becoming customer-centric. So here we are trying to develop this new service-centric economy with employees who just don't get it or won't get it. Some relief from that in the boom period, but then it was the main focus was the CEO and the senior executive team who weren't getting enough out of this upswing in the economy. So, okay, we are transitioning to a service economy, but we should be getting a lot more out of it, because all the indications were that the economy somehow was growing faster than the business. All that changes around about 2007, but it changes in a very interesting way. So suddenly what everybody's writing about is external risk. And if you look at the first period and compare it to the second period, I hope you can see the slides, maybe you can't at the back, but essentially what you've got is a focus on the internal aspects of the organization for about 20 years. Suddenly it's all about the external environment. And that's why I began by talking about externalization. Unless you can master the external environment, unless you can somehow imagine what your ecosystems are about, and who knows what the ecosystem of a financial organization is. You know, it's a puzzle. I presented to other banks on this, and I see puzzle faces looking back. You know, we sell stuff, we sell services. But actually, the future lies with how well you can manage the external environment. Now, I know you can't see this one, so I'll tell you what's on there. The kind of things that people are externalizing, if you look at hardware device manufacturers like smartphone manufacturers at the moment, or audio device manufacturers like Harman, traditionally the design of that product has been their brand. You know a Bang & Olufsen through its design. Equally, you would know a Harman car product through its design. But they now externalize that. They no longer feel it's worth the risk of designing things themselves. So things are absolutely core to their identity. They're much more content with leaving that or going to a major brand design agency or major hardware design agency and having that done for them. There is, as I said earlier, the ecosystem, that other element of externalization. But there are also things like social media. You know, most people now would try to capture the attention of their advocates on Facebook or on Twitter. You're, of course, not outsourcing that work to those advocates, but you are trying to manage it. You're trying somehow to capture that external audience and make it yours and make it work for you. So in this risk-laden environment, by the way, when I talk about risk, the writers that I studied weren't just talking about financial risk. This wasn't about the financial collapse. It was about the risk of competition from China, or political risk or ecological risk. It seemed like suddenly everybody was conscious of risk. So externalization is one way that you can offload some of the burden of management in a risk-laden environment, but it's also facing reality that the external environment is extremely dynamic and extremely valuable. So, again, if you look at Apple, the 300,000 companies that built apps for them were not an investment on Apple's part. It didn't have to actually commit capital to that. So what I've been trying to do since I did this work is, and again, I apologize for the small graphics, and I'll talk you through some key elements of it, is to create a maturity model, to try and look at how organizations change from what they were, and most organizations still have one foot in the old industrial area, and that might be through their legacy IT systems, for example, hierarchical legacy IT, to the service era, that 20-year period that I've been trying to describe in the first slide, to this elastic era. And let me hone in on one element of that. In terms of innovation, what's happened, if you go back to the industrial era, most successful organizations had fantastic research labs. If you think of Corning or Dow Chemical or DuPont, or you think of Nokia, these were companies that invested very heavily in producing the inventions or innovations that they could then put their enormous marketing machines behind and market at a global consumer base. And that's the way it used to work. You had oligopoly power in the market. You probably have oligopoly power in the Australian market. Develop your products, and with marketing muscle, you can be pretty sure of a reasonably predictable level of uptake. But in this service era, companies started to realize that oligopoly power was breaking down. If you talk to companies like Ericsson, that's the biggest culture shock they faced, because now there are 3 Chinese companies that do telecommunications infrastructure better, faster than they do. So they no longer have this power, and that means they've gone out to a more open form of innovation, and they're trying to, as it were, corral their customer base before they make the product. So that was that service period, open innovation, trying to adapt to different economic circumstances. But I think where we are now is open innovation is becoming less relevant as well. I think now what you see is that companies that have got this right reduce the management burden to the point where they can make all kinds of adjacency moves in all kinds of markets. And I hope I'm right, yes. So this idea that you make radical adjacency moves is gaining momentum. And why it's important is because traditionally you were not meant to do any adjacencies. And there are all kinds of business case studies of companies that made adjacency moves and lost dramatically. Blue Circle would be one of those, if anybody's aware of it. But I think there's now a requirement to think in adjacency terms. You have to go out and seize new markets with new products, often markets you're not familiar with, and products that you're not familiar with either. You maybe haven't even invented or developed them yourselves. So if you look, again, I use the high-tech industry for this kind of, to illustrate this, and that's because this is where the dynamic is at its strongest. But if you look at Apple, obviously it's moving to smartphones, so it's already an adjacency, but its moving to retail was more so. If you'd have asked 15 years ago who is or who will be the best retailer, the most successful retailer in the world, you would never have said Apple. You just wouldn't have thought of Apple. What is it about that organization that's it somehow managed to become the best in terms of revenue per square foot in most countries that it operates? I think it's because it doesn't have the burden of management that a lot of companies leave themselves with. It's externalized so much of its operations that the senior executive team has time to look around and acquire the skills it needs to move into new areas like retail. Microsoft moving into telephony with Skype, it's not doing it particularly well at the moment, but it now describes itself as a device company. Microsoft is about device and services, and for 30 years it's been the dominant software and OS company. Google into mobile, of course, with the purchase of Motorola Mobility, but now into lending. In the last 3 weeks, it's bought a lending company, a peer-to-peer loans company. Watch out for that. These companies don't care which markets they go into. And I think they're a threat, and we know they're a threat to anybody. And now into autos with the driverless car. It's so counterintuitive to do these things, but they're being done more and more. Walmart trying to open a bank. And I think that segues into the third shift, the device economy. Increasingly, we will mediate most of our business transactions, but most of our social transactions through some kind of device. Ericsson reckoned that by 2020, so only 7 years away, there will be 500 billion connected devices in the world. And already in some countries, people have an average of 14 devices. So if you think of your connected car, your Xbox in the home, your phone, your tablet, your laptop, your I've said smartphone. So increasingly when you do things, actually try to illustrate it with this, you know, if you go to a Disney theme park now, you wear a band, and the band records your activity in the park and starts to present options for you when you go to rides or you go to cafes or events. So it's trying to personalize your experience. But it means that even taking the kids for a ride is being mediated by a device. And a lot of people wear a Fitband, so our health is starting to be mediated by devices. And of course, the device gives you access to data. It allows you to collect data. It means you have to create a data platform, some kind of data platform in the background to deal with that data. But I think it's as important as the shift from an industrial to a service economy. If you think about it, we're sort of coming full circle. All those organizations that abandoned hardware and said, you know, we can be pure service companies, I think, again, look out, because you're going to need some kind of hardware strategy. You're going to need to relate to devices and relate to your consumer base through devices. And that brings me to the fourth shift, which is towards narrow innovation. I think, again, a lot of companies, when they talk about being more creative, anticipate some kind of major invention or major advance in what they're doing. But actually, really good companies at the moment are making lots and lots of small advances. And narrow innovation is something that preoccupies a lot of CIOs. I interviewed the CIO at the Washington Post recently, and this was his complaint. You know, every time Facebook changes something, every time Twitter changes something, he's got to reinvent his apps. So he needs people right at the ground level. The people, his graduate entrants, have to come in knowing how to adapt to things like Twitter, Google Apps, or any other platform that he's interacting with. They need to know how to adapt to those things almost on a monthly basis. And his message was actually, I need people who can retrain themselves. And it used to be that I needed to do that every 5 years. But now I need people who can retrain every month, because otherwise I'm left behind. And I think that's what narrow innovation does. It means you've got to be constantly making small changes, but you need to make them in the hundreds and the thousands, whereas we've been traditionally more preoccupied with that one big advance that's going to change our organization. You see narrow innovation at work in something like Google Glass, which will be launched later this year. It'll launch with 2,000 apps. And it's really unusual. You know, if you look at what Google Glass is, it's a heads-up display. And there are plenty of heads-up displays around. And what Google has done really is just make it look prettier. In terms of a product, they've said, they had held a competition. What would you use Google Glass for? And thousands of people responded with the kind of things they would want to do with a heads-up display. And then they went to the developer community and said, will you develop apps for Google Glass? And 2,000 organizations said yes. I mean, look at the investment level from Google's point of view. Adapting somebody else's product, asking everybody else to do the work, massive publicity, and you know, the share price is up, I think, something like 150 points. So narrow innovation is really, really important. Borrowing that thing that Shinoda was talking about, finding lots and lots of things that you can string together into a melody. It's a really important concept for organizations, and Google are masters of it at the moment. I think another driver for this narrow innovation is that global market. We're accustomed to a middle class globally of 300 million people with fairly homogenous requirements. So it's that European, American, Australian, of course, that kind of homogenous group of people that have fairly similar desires from the market. It's going to change 2 billion people with disposable income in the next 15 years. And those people have very, very different requirements to the market, very different expectations as well. So I think that's going to drive many narrower and narrower innovations. You need to reach narrower and narrower markets. There is no longer a mass market, I think. And you see it in a company like Samsung, which is a company I've been following for the past 12 months. And they've managed to extend this idea of narrow innovation even into hardware. And it's a really, really phenomenal achievement when you think about what they're able to do. They've just launched the Samsung S4 6 weeks ago. Within those 6 weeks, they've also announced 4 variants of the S4. And these are major variants. They're like new products-ish. They're narrow innovations around that product. But to be able to do that, no hardware company's been able to do it in the past, no hardware company's been motivated to do it. But they now have 150 phones in the US, different types of phones. They make every type of display you can think of. They lead the market in OLED displays. They're pushing IP in OLED all the time. And they make all these other things like computers and phones and tablets and TVs. But they're always trying to target narrow market bands. So I think what you're seeing is that, yes, it's possible to do narrow innovation in software. It's tougher in services. It used to be impossible in hardware, but now it's necessary there as well. So my wrap up, the big shift, I think, is product to service to elastic, but there's some sense in which we're coming home to devices, this connected product. We're going back towards product, back towards hardware. But we're moving out. Obviously, we've known it for a long time. We have to move out of this kind of siloed IT, kind of programmatic strategy, the 5-year plan or the 3-year plan, the closed R&D programs. We know retrospectively that we've been trying to do that service economy thing where we become more agile. We talk about open innovation and open management, and we outsource, we do knowledge management as distinct from the old kind of siloed IT, we do knowledge management. But I think now it's about platform and cloud, it's about APIs and narrow innovation. It's about these radical adjacencies, being able and willing to move into new markets where you have no familiarity. And it's also about what I would call elastic resource management, that what you now need to think of is not how much can I invest to get a given result, but how can I attract resources to my organization, whether that's in your social media marketing or in some kind of device platform strategy that you develop. Having financial muscle is far less important than in the past. So back to the start, what I think when I talk to people about innovation, I think if I was in an organization maybe like this and people said you have to be more creative, I think I'd run scared of that proposition. I'd like to do that in my leisure time and not necessarily in my work time. I wouldn't necessarily know what it means to be more creative in work, but I would know what it means to make better decisions. If the organization was saying to me, we're going to delegate more to you because of this externalization process, we need our people on the ground to be more aware of our business strategy. We need the people on the ground to inform our business strategy more. Then I'd start to listen. I'd start to wake up to that kind of message. But I think instead what people do when they hear this creativity message is they say, well, what do you expect of me? What is this new thing I'm supposed to do? I'm used to trying to do the right thing for you. But I think what they need to be asking and what senior management needs to be interacting around is how can they learn a new basis for decision making, one that's centered on these external relationships that they're the ones that come into contact with. So what are the right partner options in the kinds of groups that I deal with? How can my organization devolve risk with new products? How can we create more options so we can create that new melody for the organization? Are there any ecosystem opportunities available around the business that I do for AMP? And I think finally the kind of message that senior management needs to convey is, look, we cannot make life simple anymore. We've tried to routinize and simplify all aspects of our business for 30 years so we can make life simple at the coalface, but we can't do that now. But given that we can't do that, given that we can't simplify things, is it maybe time that we can look out to new horizons and actually create some new kind of dream for what AMP can do and what we can achieve together? So I think that's my message. Replace this idea of creativity with some sense of new horizons and new things that you can all achieve together. And that's that. Okay.